It should be live now. I'm going to share it
Okay.
in my profile first, and then we are good to go.
Okay.
Okay. Can you see the? Can you see me now?
Me,
Patricia?
I can, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
I can
Hello.
see you. I don't know if anybody else can.
Yeah. If you can see, probably everyone else is seeing me well. Hello, everyone. We will be talking today about the book Science, a 4,000-year history. And I'm glad to inform you that the writer of this book, Dr. Patricia Fara, is with us today. Hello, Patricia.
Hello, and thank you very, very much for inviting me to do this. It's very flattering, so thank you.
No problem. And we are very excited to talk to you about your book today. Uh, First, I'm going to give you some introduction about you. I mean, just to introduce you.
Yeah.
Dr. Patricia Fara is a historian of science at the University of Cambridge. She was a former fellow of Darwin College and is an Erasmus Fellow of Clare College. She was previously director of studies in the history of philosophy and science. And she has written many books, including the Science, a 4,000-year history, that the book I will be talking about today. Her other books include Scientists Anonymous, Pandora's Breaches, Fatal Attraction, Erasmus Darwin, Sex, Botany, and Empire, etc. So first, my question today to you is, I ask to most of my the guests who come here, why do you write? If in other terms, if you were not a historian, would you be still a writer?
Oh, I think so. I absolutely love writing. And when I look back over my career, I can see that I've ended up doing what I always wanted to do because I've actually got a degree in physics. And when I left university, I wanted to be a science journalist. And I went to the careers board. And at that stage, there wasn't such a thing as a science journalist. They said I'd have to start out being an ordinary provincial journalist and going to cricket matches and weddings and things. And so I didn't really fancy that. So I went into computing, and I'd been there for about 5 years. And I left that and I set up a company with my then husband, and we made audiovisual presentations about computing and statistics. And I was writing all the scripts. So that was really when I learned to write. And then at some stage along the way, I parted company with my husband, went back to university, got a PhD as a historian of science, and then I came to Cambridge. And I've written lots of academic articles and academic monographs, so I know how to do all that stuff with the footnotes and to do it technically. But I think it's such a challenge writing for a general audience, and I think in a way, I have always felt, ever since I was running that computer education company, I've always felt a slight responsibility. I'm a very privileged, educated person, and I'm very excited about the work that I do, and I just love sharing it with other people. And there's quite a challenge in explaining things in a way that everybody can understand, because academics have got their own jargon, their own shorthand. It's quite difficult to get out of that. And trying to make a book interesting as well as informative is a challenge that I really, really enjoy.
Great. Uh, Glad that you enjoy writing so that we get so many nice books from you. And this book, Science 4,000-year history, it is divided into, may I say, 7 divisions, and each of these divisions have 7 chapters. So it's wonderful to read this book and know about different parts of science and different aspects of science and the history of it.
Can I just say something? I thought a lot about writing that book, and I'd wanted to do it for a long while. And the structure was really, really difficult to find because one of my main motives was to get away from the standard progressive history, this idea that science just gets better and better and better. And once I had that idea of the seven and the seven, and of course seven in a lot of cultures is a sort of magic, a special number. Once I got that idea of the seven and seven structure, it really helped me to write something that, although it does go chronologically, and I think if you're writing a history, it's very difficult to avoid that, but it wasn't strictly chronological. It moved from place to place, and I hope got away from this idea that somehow progress is inevitable. So that structure of the 7 by 7 was quite a major breakthrough for me. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, my internet connection sometimes gives me trouble, so I would ask the co-host Kaustuv Odhigari to carry on if that happens. Yeah, so like you tried to include everything of science for 4,000 years in 400-page book. So I'm just wondering, when did science begin? I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. I'm just wondering, there should be science or inventions before 4,000 years, and then
There were, I think 4,000 years was an arbitrary date. And there's a sort of definition that always annoys my students, but then I eventually persuade them that it's a very good definition, that science is what scientists do. And of course, 4,000 years ago, I start with the Babylonians, there wasn't, people didn't regard themselves as doing science, but on the other hand, a lot of things that they were doing have influenced modern science. So Babylonians were great astronomers, and the reason that we've got the 12 signs of the zodiac, that we've got 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, that all goes back to the Babylonians. And I think the further back you go, the less like modern science the people's activities looked. But on the other hand, it was absolutely crucial for modern science. So, for example, people who were making jewelry, or farmers who were developing agricultural techniques, or sailors that were navigating, or people that were studying the weather, or miners who were going down and looking at all the minerals underneath the earth. All their knowledge built up and accumulated, and it became absorbed into what we call science today. So there's definitely not a date that science started. And there was science before there was scientists. In the English language, the word scientist didn't appear until 1833. And I think it would be a bit foolish to say there wasn't any science before then. Well, there wasn't any science, but technically there weren't any scientists doing it. So there's a way in which the concept of science and scientists didn't really exist. And in English anyway, and in the other European languages, during the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, the word science, which comes from Latin for knowledge, it meant sort of organized, book-type knowledge, systematic knowledge, as opposed to practical knowledge and skills like playing a piano or using a telescope or something like that. So science itself has changed in meaning, and the word scientist didn't even exist until about 150 years ago in English. No, 200 years ago in English. Are you still there?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So my second question is, I'm quoting from your book, the section called Magic. In 1947, the economist John Maynard
Maynard.
shocked the academic world by announcing that Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians.
Uh-huh.
And scientists were scandalized. They refused to believe that their greatest hero could be tainted by any association with astrology, alchemy, and other magical crafts. But historians now agree with Keynes' verdict. So I'm wondering if we know that Newton was a hero in science. We quote him from time to time, but he was also kind of a magician, and he used to believe some weird things that science would not permit you to theorize anyway. I mean,
Well, I
So
don't quite agree. I don't quite agree with that last bit. But first, if you think about an individual whenever they're living, think of all of us now. We, everybody here, all of you people joining in, you might produce some great scientific theory that will strongly influence what happens in 200 years. But you have no idea of that. All you know is what lies in your past. So you're constantly looking behind you and you're developing and improving what lies in your own past. So Isaac Newton had no idea that gravity was going to be so important. But he took his ideas from his predecessors, and a lot of the knowledge that he used did derive from magicians. Magicians are often maligned. We sort of think of magicians, I don't know, pulling a rabbit out of a hat, or doing, sort of invoking some strange spell or summoning up the devil. There were a lot of what were called natural magicians who were trying to learn about the world and trying to control the world in order to produce different chemicals or to cure people's illnesses. So in a sense, they had very much the same objectives as modern scientists do today. And Newton spent a lot of time doing alchemy. The basis of modern chemistry is alchemy. You can hear it in the similarity of the words, but a lot of the instruments that were used in chemical laboratories in the 18th and 19th centuries, like alembic flasks, were developed by alchemists. Astrologers had a very deep knowledge of the stars and of the planetary movements. And there's another huge misconception about Newton. Newton is often said to have eliminated God and religion from the universe, and that is completely untrue. For Newton said specifically that God is the universe, God is time, God is space. God was very, very, very important for Newton. It was only 100 years later that the deterministic version of Newtonianism, which we have now, was developed in France. And Newton himself would be horrified if he realized that science is promoting this sort of soulless, materialistic world with no God in it, with no spirit. He wouldn't recognize that at all.
yeah, and also I'm connecting to that. In the Islamic world, and also later on in the medieval world, and in Europe, science and the religion, they both ran hand to hand. So I'm just wondering, because the religious institutions were promoting science, and they were the center of
Oh,
scientific.
absolutely. If you think of where I am, I'm based in a Cambridge college. Cambridge colleges were religious foundations, and if anybody watching has ever been to either Oxford or Cambridge, they'll know that each college has got a chapel in the middle, and the chapel is a really important part. Or if you think of the first universities that were developed in Paris in the 13th century, that they were associated with the monasteries. And it's the same. I don't know a huge amount about the Islamic Empire, but as I understand it, it was a very, very similar process there, that the hospitals and the libraries and the universities and the astronomical observatories were all based around the mosques. And it was just like in Christianity, you need to do astronomy in order to work out the calendars. It's very, the time of Easter and our religious festival, it's the same in the Muslim world, and you also need to be able to work out the direction of Mecca. So there's a very important relationships between science and religion. They absolutely were not divorced. That was an attempt in the 19th and 20th century to separate them out, and that separation didn't exist before then.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm wondering if current time is different, right? So the religious institutes have been separated from the scientific institutes in most modern science in the world. Uh, and what do you see in the future, how the science will go? Uh, I mean, so will it remain as a separate entity and never be able to reconnect with the religious entity ever in the future?
Well, I think the reason they separated is because in the 19th century, when scientists were struggling to establish an identity and authoritative position in society, it was very important for them to distinguish themselves from religious people. I think, and there's been a great movement to eliminate religion from science, continuing in the late 20th century. I think now a lot of scientists are coming round to recognize that actually the fundamental questions that scientists and religious people are asking are exactly the same. For about 100 years, scientists have been saying they're going to find the secret of life. That's what Jim Watson and Francis Crick promised when they discovered DNA. But it's becoming more and more clear that it seems to me that scientists are absolutely unable to create life. There are all sorts of big questions which science just can't answer. It's all very well saying there was a big bang or identifying more and more subatomic particles, but there's still the basic question about where did we come from? Why is it that I'm alive? I'm not like a table or an inert piece of matter. I'm a living being. What is it that distinguishes me from inert matter? And those fundamental questions are still no nearer being resolved. And I think that's where religion and science are now coming closer. I think an increasing number of scientists are recognizing that that remains a fundamental flaw at the center of science, and science does not have all the answers.
Yeah, and but isn't that the beauty of science? I mean, it will always have some unanswered questions, and pursuing for that question, for the answer would be the way to go.
Well, I think there's different sorts of questions in science. I mean, there's questions like how do you develop a new COVID vaccine, or how do you develop a bridge that doesn't fall down? And they are part of science. But there's also another part of science, which is quantum. Why is there a big divide between quantum mechanics and relativity? I think the fact that they're fundamentally incompatible makes us aware that at its very best, all science can do is build models. There's a sense in which we have not grasped reality. Perhaps it's impossible.
My point is, if you pursue those questions and then try, wouldn't we get more answers on that? I mean, you cannot explain everything in the universe by just doing scientific work for now, but if you pursue on understanding something, eventually probably you will understand better on that source. So
well, that's what people who are interested in science have been promising for centuries, and it doesn't seem to me that we're any nearer understanding the answers to those questions. And we've got more and more complicated equations, and we certainly know more about quarks and all the other fundamental particles, and we know more about the immensity of the universe, and we now are conjecturing that there's black matter everywhere that nobody really understands. It seems to me that every time one question is resolved, then there's 100 others that are opened up. And it doesn't seem to me that we are fundamentally approaching an answer, approaching truth. But in that sense, I think nor do religious people. Religious people seem happier to accept that there's a mystery at the center of everything, whereas scientists, until relatively recently, a lot of scientists have been claiming to provide the answer, and I don't think they are providing it. But it's only my personal opinion.
Oh, okay, thank you. Kaustubh, you have any question for Patricia?
Well, we could
Hello.
ask. Oh, hello. Yeah, well, we could ask for a substantial number of our readers who are aspiring women scientists, and they have always wanted to ask, especially from women guests, that how they could better evolve to be scientists themselves. I mean, if you have particular words of advice for these aspiring women scientists among our listeners.
Advice for aspiring women scientists, I think one piece of advice is to develop quite a thick skin, and don't be too deterred by people who make remarks, who think it's strange that a woman should be doing science. I think the situation is masses better than it used to be, and that's because women collectively are agitating for their rights. I think another problem is women tend not to apply for jobs unless they're 100% sure that they can do them. And I think if you're a woman and you see a job and you really like the sound of that, just apply for it. You won't get it if you don't apply for it. And if you don't get that job, don't assume that you're a complete failure. Just go on and apply for the next one and the next one, and eventually you will get there. So I think you have to have confidence in yourself, and I think you have to be rather assertive. You just have to be sure that you are as good at doing the job as the next person. But I do think the situation for women in science has improved colossally just during my lifetime. It's improved even during the last 10 years. And most, but not all, most of the men that I know in academia, most of them are also very, very keen on promoting the interests of women, because there's a lot of women who are extremely, extremely, extremely good scientists, and it's a bit silly to leave out half the potential pool.
And the proportion of women science writers we see today is also relatively low. As you say, it has increased from the past, but it's still quite low. So do you have any advice, well, to science writers in general, people who want to write about science and want to reach out to more people in terms of writing popular science?
I think if you want to reach out to more people, just do it. And in a way, under lockdown, it's quite a good opportunity to do it.
Oh, I,
I think
I
your
think your
Start writing,
connection.
start posting.
I think your connection was quite noisy this time. We couldn't hear it.
Oh, I see. I'd said that now under lockdown, there's a huge number of online activities, far more than in the past. So this is a very good opportunity to start writing short items, to get them posted on the web. There's lots of sites that are looking for interesting items. People are crying out for information. So I think now is a very good opportunity to just start. And you can't become a science writer unless you actually do it. You just got to start and do it, and you've got to learn from what you do wrong and try to do the next thing better. And I think another rule is it's important to get things done, not to be too perfectionist. If you're sort of 98% happy with what you've done, let it go, get it printed, published on the web, and move on to the next project. A lot of people never finish their PhDs because they want it to be 100% perfect. And I think it's important just to keep going. And whenever you produce a piece of work, you will always yourself be very critical of it, because you are more intimate with all its imperfections than anybody else is. But you just got to keep going. And take advice. If you write something, ask other people to read it. And when they criticize it, don't get offended and don't get upset, but incorporate what they say. You might not agree with all of it, but incorporate the good bits and learn from that. So I think the more people you can get to read your work, to edit it, to comment on it, the better your work will be. Can you hear me better now?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
And if anyone wants to ask questions, please ask away from the Zoom meeting. Anyone wants to ask questions, please raise your hand or tell me in the chat box. I will take the questions from the Zoom meeting first and then go to the Facebook. And yeah, Sneha Chaudhuri has raised her hand. Please ask.
Ma'am, I want to know what is microlithos.
What is?
Microlithos.
Oh, she is asking a very basic question. What is microliters?
Microliters? You mean
Yeah.
a thousandth of a liter?
Right. I guess she's a school student. I don't know.
Okay, so why is it that you want to know that, Sneha?
Because I don't know about history, anything. So I want to know what is microlithos.
Okay, so microliters, the whole system of liters and kilograms and meters, that was invented in France at the end of the 18th century. And so you get centimeters is a hundredth of a meter, or a centiliter is a hundredth of a liter. A deciliter is a tenth of a liter, and a microliter is a thousandth of a liter. And it's a very sensible, rational system that all links together and makes it much easier than systems where you have inches and feet and miles and yards, which are very difficult to work out. So microliters are a really, really sensible way of organizing it, and that's what scientists use.
Related to that, I will come to Mashroof Hossain later, but after my question. Related to that, why is the counting system in America is different? I mean, they're reluctant to take the metric system for everything. They use gallon, they use miles, and
it's mad because their gallons are different from British gallons. And there was a lot of problem on one of the space missions. I can't remember when, about 30 years ago. There was some awful problem because the Americans were using their system and everybody else was using the metric system. And of course, nothing really matched up. I have no idea why they are. But we in Britain, we're supposedly metric, but we still have our road signs are in miles per hour, and we drive on the left-hand side of the road. But I have no idea if now, unfortunately, we've left the EU. I mean, personally, I think it's a disaster. I have no idea if we're going to go back to miles and inches and yards, and I very, very much hope not.
Okay. Mashroof.
At least in America, you've got sensible money. I mean, your dollars and cents. I mean, until about, I can't remember, about 50 years ago, we still had pounds, shillings, and pence, and that was an absolute nightmare.
Right. Okay, Mashroof, please ask your question.
Well, hi, Patricia. I have actually a question. This might be a bit sensitive, but you are probably the right person to answer this question. So my specific question is, I come from a country, of course, I'm from Bangladesh, and it's a Muslim majority country. And in many of the times, the scientific ideas clashes with the Islamic religious identity. So many of the people actually reject the science. For example, evolution is still a very taboo topic in our country. So my question is, what I've heard, and even I've seen some British advertisements, I can send you the link, which shows that the Middle Age, which means the Dark Age, which is called the Middle Age in history, it was actually the Islamic Islamic golden age of science. So when I actually started to discuss this with people, that the Dark Age, the way people reject science from the Islamic point of view, it was not always so, even in a couple of 100 years back. Then I got backlash from both the parties. One party was very extreme. They said that everything that you see in modern science actually came from Islam, which is obviously not true. And in other part, they were actually challenging that no, Islamic system or the Islamic civilization have really no contribution at all. Whatever contribution that is in the name of Islamic civilization is actually people who did not really believe in the Islamic system or the religion. So I would like your objective opinion on that, how much actually the Islamic civilization has contributed to the science and the development of science.
Okay, well, to start with, I don't think historians can give you an objective answer, but as I understand how it happened, was in the Islamic Golden Age, indeed, starting in about the 8th and 9th century, what we call AD, using the European calendar, the 8th and 9th century. There was a school of scholarship in Baghdad, and they translated a lot of the Greek and Latin texts into Arabic. And then the next bit is really crucial. They didn't just carry out the translation, there were Islamic scholars who worked on those papers and who carried out experiments and took the knowledge further. But they worked on things that were particularly important to them. So, for example, they worked on medicine, they worked on astronomy, they worked on optics, on mathematics, those sort of areas. And then around about the 12th or 13th century, all that Islamic scholarship went round the top of North Africa and into Spain, which was in the Muslim Empire then, and was translated from Arabic into Latin, and then hence it spread into Northwest Europe. And so this Islamic development of the older Greek and Latin knowledge became absolutely crucial for the later development of European science. At that stage, nobody was talking about evolution. And so the incompatibility between evolution and the Quran wasn't really a problem. And one of the big problems in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries was the apparent incompatibility between evolutionary models and biblical interpretation. And I don't know enough about the Islamic faith, but in Christianity, there's different ways of interpreting the Bible, and different sectors of Christianity have different approaches towards the Bible. So some people are very, very happy to accept the Bible on a metaphorical, allegorical basis, whereas other people want to interpret the Bible in a very, very, very literal way. And then there is a problem, because if you interpret in that sort of method, then there is an incompatibility with evolution. But most of the, I mean, I know a lot, I'm not Christian, I don't have faith myself, but I know lots of people who do. My partner is very religious, and he sees exactly the same as I do about evolution, and he doesn't find any incompatibility with Christian faith at all. And I think that's true for the vast majority of Christians in this country. And I imagine, although I don't know, that there must be a lot of Muslims who approach their scriptural texts in the same spirit, that you don't have to interpret the text absolutely 100% literally. And it seems difficult to me to worry about that too much. That's my personal view.
This is
It actually answers
particularly important for us because you probably don't know that some of our free thinkers or the writers about evolution and atheism, they actually got killed in our country by some of the very, very religious parties. And these are very unfortunate. And that's why we try to teach our mass people who are reluctant to take anything, any scientific knowledge very with their open mind, to teach them what the facts are, what is evolution, and there are more of these kind of popular writing like you write are very important for us to spread and make people to read.
About 10 or 15 years ago, I went to a conference in Abu Dhabi that was run by the British Council, and it was a meeting. There were Muslim scientists. Well, there were scientists from Arabic nations. Some of them were Muslim and some of them weren't. And it was the same. There was a group of scientists from Britain who were Christian. And so the idea was to talk precisely about this problem of the compatibility of religious scriptures and science. And I had to give a talk, and it turned out I hadn't realized when I gave this talk that I was the only person who didn't have a religion and who studied science. And quite a few young Muslim women came up to me afterwards and talked to me, and they'd never met anybody in that position, because for them it had to be a choice. You either did science or you were a Muslim, and they couldn't understand how anyone could exist to whom the question was non-important. They couldn't understand that the problem that science and religion don't necessarily have to be incompatible because they're not in confrontation, and it is very difficult.
Yeah, there is. I will ask more questions by myself, but there is one question in the Facebook that I will ask first. Moumita Boshak, She asked, you broadly worked on the history of how women scientists perpetuate gender stereotypes such as odd looking or poorly dressed, atypical of other women. How we can study the history differently so that we don't make this mistake of stereotyping, how the historians should be mindful of that.
Well, one of the reasons that I write precisely about how women have been discriminated against in the past is so that we can learn from all that prejudice that there was in the past and hopefully come to understand that it's really rather ridiculous and use our knowledge of that in order to change people's opinions. So for me, one of the points of doing history is that you understand from looking at the past, you understand how it is that we reach where we are today. But the real fundamental point for me is to improve the future. And so that's why I think we have to study what's happened in the past and so hopefully move forward. And I think the same is true for other underrepresented groups. So not just women, but also people of colour, people of different ethnicities. I think theoretically they raise, and practically those groups raise a very similar problem. And the next, I've got a book coming out in February, which is going to be about, partly, it's about Isaac Newton, but it's also going to be discussing slavery and also the lack of women in Newtonian scholarship. So I think those two movements are very much the direction that historians are going in at the moment.
Going back to the science in the Islamic era, you mentioned in the division interactions and the chapter Islam, I'm quoting from your book. According to the conventional story, the Islamic civilization proved unable to sustain this intellectual momentum, referring to the scientific, scientific inventions and discoveries they were doing. And science survived only by being transmitted to Western Europe around the end of the 12th century. Put more dramatically, in the great race towards scientific truth, the Arabs fell by the wayside as Europeans picked up the torch of knowledge. But you have an argument against this. Could you? And this is very interesting to me. So I'm just want to hear from you.
Well, I mean that is the conventional view. I mean, I'm not. Let me emphasise. My speciality is 18th century England. I am not a specialist in the Islamic Empire and all this work that was carried on. But there is a huge number of scholars who are very interested in that. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that more and more scientific research was going on in the Islamic Empire and also in other parts of the world, China, for example, or Japan. And it's just that in standard Western accounts of the history of science, that work has not been considered. I mean, one question which I thought you would probably ask me and which nobody has yet, so I'll ask it on my own behalf, is I wrote that book, well, it came out in 2009, so I wrote it about, getting on for 15 years ago. How would I change it? I mean, you know, I hadn't thought about it for a long while, and I've been looking at it the last few days because obviously I knew I was going to speak today. And I tried very hard to get away from the idea of inevitable progress. And I tried very, very hard to get away as much as I could from a Eurocentric perspective and to write about other cultures, including the Islamic Empire, including China. But it's quite an indication of how much has changed in history, what sort of questions historians are asking now. And there's a whole post-colonial movement. And if I were going to rewrite, I don't know how I would do it, but I know that if I were to start again and write that book, I would have far, far more about what was going on in the rest of the world, and I would make a far greater attempt to get away from that trajectory of focusing on Northwest Europe and America. And it's very difficult to escape that, partly because I am from Northwest Europe, but also until recently, so were most historians of science. But there's now historians of science all over the world who are writing the history of science of their own country. So if I was going to rewrite it, I would incorporate much more of that research. Because obviously, when I wrote the book, I was very dependent on the research of other people, and I was quite upfront and quite candid about that at the front of the book. I said, you know, I've had to depend on other people's scholarship. And there's so much more of it now that I would make it now a much, much more international account.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize too that writing in their own language in different countries and their own history and about science and everything is very important in this sense. If you don't document it, it will not be documented by the world historians so that you will know that knowledge after like 200 years from now.
And I think I don't really like the way that English has become the international language, and I find it rather embarrassing that there's a sort of new form of imperialism that my native language is the language of the world. But on the other hand, it means it is much easier for everybody to share the scholarship. So research into what happened in Bangladesh, for example, that research will not stay confined within Bangladesh. It will spread across the world and be shared by everybody. So that is a huge advantage of having a language in common. I just personally feel a bit embarrassed about being English, but it's not really my fault. I happen to be born here.
Yeah, and one of my experiences of reading English books, rather like life science books in English, is that I know a lot about, say, I'm reading about American birds. So I know a lot about, from reading the book, I know a lot about beak of one bird, like to some great details. But I don't know what kind of birds our country has in Bangladesh, because people don't write that many science books in our country, which is very unfortunate. And people need to come up and write more and more these kind of books, that I feel.
So are you an ornithologist? Is that your speciality?
No. I just read books in life science. I read different kinds of books.
Okay, so, all right, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
So you're from Bangladesh and you're at MIT, is that right? So why are you at MIT? Why aren't you in Bangladesh?
Because because of the opportunities of research that I get here, I won't be able to get there. I won't be translate my research into something great for in the future if I don't get the opportunity. But now that I'm trained, I can go back and try something, but I feel like it will be kind of difficult. So I'm staying in my comfort zone now.
Yeah, it is a very real problem, and that would be one of the things, if I were to rewrite this book, that would be one of the things that I would write about. That all the brilliant scholars from all over the world are all ending up congregating in America and Northwest Europe. And so the whole problem is becoming exacerbated. And that's one of the things I'd write about, is the sort of political implications of scientific research.
Yeah, that's why we have a term called brain drain. All of our intellectuals and bright minds are leaving our country. So that's, in a sense, is not a very good sign for our future.
But that's what that expression, brain drain, it's interesting you say that. I haven't heard that expression for about 30 years. And it's what we used to say, it's what people used to say about going to America. But we don't say it anymore. I'm not quite sure why, but we don't say it anymore. So it was a bit of a shock when you said that. Yeah.
Okay. So I have reminded you some old word then.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. But anyway, I mean, that's the sort of thing I would write about. And also, just I'm thinking, last week in the news, there was a big item in Britain accusing Russia of stealing our vaccination research into COVID. And that struck me as being so sad that we've got a global pandemic crisis, And this idea that the Russians and the British should be arguing about who owns the research is so counterproductive. I mean, it's just got to change and become more international.
Kostu and Mushroom, both of you probably have questions. Mushroom, go first.
So my question is, this brain drain is actually a very real problem. I'm not from scientific background. I study public administration, so I also came to US for a higher degree. Then here, seeing the opportunities, of course, apart from the personal benefits, the opportunity to pursue the field of knowledge and meeting the great minds, I would say that like anyone would be very much tempted to stay here and make a living there. Even if you take off the like material benefits, the freedom of mind and the capability to like interact with people, intellectuals from all over the world in a small place. So that is very tempting. And I'm sure that like that is not the first thing that is happening in history. It has been happening and it has been recurring time and again. So as you are a science historian, my question to you is, I mean, how to like reverse this process in favor of a developing country like Bangladesh? What history says about it? Like when something like this happened to England or any other place, how did they do it and what was the process? If we want to do it now.
Well, I know that a policy that some countries have implemented is that when they give their students research grants to go and study abroad, one of the conditions of the research of the studentship is that they should go back to their home country and remain there for at least 5 years. But I mean, it's a very real problem, and I hope I'm not sounding critical. If I were in your position, I would also go to America or Europe or Australia or wherever the opportunities are, because you've got this sort of dilemma. You've got your own life to live and your own interests and your own ambitions, and it's unrealistic and unfair to expect you to sacrifice those to go back to your own country. I mean, presumably at some stage, what will happen is that so many people will come to America or Britain that there won't be room for everybody and they'll start going back somewhere else. I mean, I have no idea how that's going to work. I mean, I suppose one possibility might be that now we've got lockdown, and I presume you've got lockdown in Bangladesh as well, but I don't really know. I mean, this is an unprecedented opportunity for an international conversation that probably wouldn't have happened a year ago, because everybody is so into Zoom these days. So perhaps this awful pandemic will in some ways equalize the situation, because it doesn't really matter where you're based. You can be anywhere, and the same is true with a lot of scientific research. Increasingly, scientific research isn't about pouring one liquid into another, it's about doing things on computers. So you can have teams that are spread around the world. So perhaps computer technology and the shift after this pandemic are going to be one way that the situation will improve.
Makes
Yeah.
sense. Makes sense.
I mean, one of the most famous ancient empires is the Roman Empire, for example. I mean, the Romans were here in Britain, and the Romans were everywhere, all over Europe. But eventually, for some various reasons, whether it was the lead in the pipes or whatever it was, the Roman Empire collapsed and Christianity arose, and then there's going to be some other empire. And I mean, it will all change. Things do constantly evolve. I'm a historian. I can't predict the future, but I think it is a very, very, very real problem. This brain drain from so many countries. It's awful.
Thank you very much.
Kostu, please.
Yes, well, we wanted to talk a little bit about the current situation of the pandemic, which we have seen has caused a great deal of anti-science mentality or a distrust of scientists and experts. I mean, in the UK, even before that, although we have seen ministers go on TV and say that the country has enough of experts. So as a historian of science, how do you see this current mood compared to situations in the past?
Well, I think one thing that's happening now is that people in Britain, and certainly people in America, are wishing that the government would take more notice of scientists and more notice of the experts. I think it's not scientists that are being maligned everywhere, it's governments that are being maligned. And also individual scientists that are not following their own advice. There have been several big cases here of very, very eminent people who've broken all the rules. But I don't think there really is an anti-expert situation in this country. I think what most people feel here is that we wish that the government would follow the scientists' advice more closely. And I mean, and sort of in a way, the government's in a situation where they've got to weigh up the political and the economic implications against the scientific implications. And I think what most people feel is that too often the government is giving too much weight to the political and economic implications and not enough to the scientific advice that's being given. So I don't think people mistrust the scientific advice, they just mistrust the way the government's handling that advice, which is a bit different. But I don't know what it's like in other countries.
So you were talking more specifically about the UK situation.
Yeah, I was talking about the UK situation, but in America, you've got there's a president who doesn't seem to take much account of what scientists say at all. But it's rather an unusual situation.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking me? You're looking a bit bewildered.
Well, for example, in the US, there's a huge anti-mask kind of movement among general right-wing people.
That's sort of what I meant is, I think the situation here, Boris Johnson was rather like Trump in that he wouldn't wear a mask for a long while, and there was a lot of criticism of him for that. I think the situation in America in that respect is worse in that you've got a leadership who's taking less notice of the scientific experts than they are in the UK. I mean, I don't want to start on a political harangue, but you can probably infer what my feelings are about President Trump.
I will ask you a few more questions, but Prachi Ghosh wants to ask a question. Prachi, go ahead.
Uncle, I'm Pial, Prachi's brother.
Okay, Priyam, go ahead.
Ma'am, I'm Pial Datta. Ma'am, when I listened that you were coming, I started searching in the internet about this book. I've read some pages, but I couldn't understand. Can you please describe the topics easily for me?
Which topic? Sorry, I missed the beginning.
I'll asking, he wanted to read your book, but he could not understand what this book is all about. Like, could you please explain in short what
Oh,
this
in short, he wants me to explain.
He's probably a high school student, primaries.
Yes. Well, that's actually a very interesting question, and perhaps I should write a short book for school children about the history of science. So basically, what this book is about is trying to answer the question, why is science so important in modern society? And how is it, just going back hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, we didn't have aeroplanes and bridges and Zoom conferences. How has it become possible for all those things to happen? And so what I did in my book was I tried to tell the story of how 4,000 years ago there were people who didn't have central heating, didn't have cars, who just were building their houses out of wood and bricks and things like that. How we got from there and how people invented writing and they invented all sorts of other things to end up where we are today. So that's the short version. Does that help?
I'm not hearing from
Yes,
you.
ma'am.
Does that help? Okay. So what are you a student? Raki, are you a student?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So what's your favorite subject?
Ma'am, science.
Okay. So I think it's wonderful that you are interested in the history of science, because I think the history of science is very important for understanding the politics of science and what science is going to be like in the future. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for talking to me.
Yeah, it's very
Thank you, ma'am.
exciting for us that some of our audiences are very, very young.
Yes, I think it's fantastic. Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, in the chapter genes, you started quoting from Charles Darwin, saying the reckless, degraded, and often vicious members of society tend to increase at a quicker rate than the provident and generally virtuous members. So I'm
that's a very 90s. It's not my view.
right.
And that's a very, very 19th century British view. And you could say that the whole of Darwin's evolution is 19th century British capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah. So then I'm guessing there is people tend to link Darwin's discovery with the bad and dangerous eugenics practice that had occurred later on, theorized by many American scientists, and then practiced by the Nazis, and that was a very unfortunate and dangerous practice at that time. I'm wondering, is it fair to connect Darwin with those kind of social experiments on human beings that
I think it's certainly fair because, I mean, well, for one thing, the evolutionary theory that Darwin formulated isn't exactly the same as the evolutionary theory that we've got now. And secondly, it was a theory that was developed very, very much on competition, on survival, the survival of the fittest, of ensuring improvement. So it was a theory that originated in Victorian capitalism. And so it seems to me quite natural that there should be a two-way interaction, that Victorian capitalists and competitive capitalists should try to justify what they were doing on the basis of Darwinism. But so I don't think you can really criticize Darwinism because Darwin is so tied up in that competitive theory. And I mean, Darwin himself was so, you could say he was, there's a positive view of eugenics, this idea that there's a positive view and a negative view. So the positive view is that you encourage wealthy middle-class people to have children. And then the negative side of eugenics is when you actually prevent people that the Victorians regarded as being inferior from having children. So there's two different approaches to it. But I think social Darwinism and Victorian capitalism are really unfortunately quite closely tied together, yes. And I don't think you can blame the scientific theory for being misapplied. I mean, that's how things work. So you're looking very dissatisfied, everybody.
No. That's a nice answer from you.
But your voice breaks from time to time, so sometimes it's just hard.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, I think another quite interesting example of the same sort of phenomenon is in the 18th century, when Carl Linnaeus classified plants, he did it on the basis of what he called the male sexual characteristics and the female sexual characteristics. And he made the primary division of plants according to the male characteristics, and the secondary ones were the female characteristics. Now, it seems to me that that's arbitrary. It's just based on his social preconceptions that men are superior to women. But then after that view of male superiority, of male primacy, became embedded within scientific classification, then scientists could, or everybody could turn around and say, look, it's true in nature, therefore it should be true in science. And I think there's a similar sort of circular loop with Darwinism and eugenics, that Darwin says this is how evolution works on the basis of competition, and evolution represents improvement. So then people turn the whole theory on its head and they say, right, we want improvement, so therefore we've got to have more competition. And it's a sort of circular loop that it's a sort of a logic that doesn't really hold together at all. And it arises because science isn't objective. Scientific theories are very much rooted in the nature of society. So that's why that interaction, that constant mutual interaction, becomes possible. Is that, you all looking a bit happier now?
Yeah, probably the voice was the reason why.
Sorry, that's because because I'm actually having to speak quite loudly, and it's difficult to remember to speak quite loudly the whole time.
Yeah, understand. So I will borrow 5 to 10 more minutes from you. Is it that okay?
Yeah,
okay.
No, I'd be delighted, yeah.
So one of our renowned translators, the Bengali translators of our country, G.H. Habib, he wanted to join with us, but some technical problems appeared. So I'm sure he would ask you about the translation rights of your book. And are there translations of your book in other languages? And
yes, it's been translated, I think, into 9 languages, I think. Chinese, Turkish, Korean, Spanish, Portuguese. If he or she would like translation rights, that would be absolutely fine. I mean, we can arrange that, yes.
Okay, yeah, that's great to hear.
Oh, yes. Yeah, just get in touch with me and I'll set it up.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
It'd be very exciting. Let me say, it'd be very exciting for me to be translated into Bangladeshi. That would be a great honor.
For ours as well. Like, not all of us are comfortable in reading in English or some other foreign languages. So that will be
that would be absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. Sneha wants to ask one more question.
Sneha, you asked a question before, didn't you? You asked. Was it you who asked the question about microliters?
Yes, ma'am.
So what would you like?
I'm guessing Sneha is breaking up.
Ma'am?
Yes?
Ma'am, I want to know about your book, Newton.
My book?
About your...
Did you understand that?
I'm guessing she is asking about your new book.
About my new book. Okay,
yeah,
my new.
And
okay.
I also wanted to ask you what you are writing these days and what's your plan on writing.
Okay, so the new book's finished and it's coming out in February, and it's about the last 30 years of Isaac Newton's life, when he left Cambridge and he came to live in London, and he was running the Royal Mint. And it's a very different sort of view of Newton from the one you usually learn about. He sat under the apple tree and he was a very reclusive scholar and he was doing maths the whole time. This Isaac Newton was incredibly rich. He made a lot of money on the stock market. And I write about his connection with the international slave trade because he was at the Royal Mint, so he was responsible for making all of Britain's gold coins. And of course, all the gold for the coins had to come from Africa. And also he was very involved with a very large international company, the East India Company, and he was one of the shareholders in that. So it's a very different sort of version of Isaac Newton from the one that's normally told. What I've been doing during lockdown is two different things. One is I've been writing what I hope is a popular book about scientific caricatures. So I've been taking a cartoon, a caricature, and writing about 1,000 words to explain what the science is behind it. Caricatures from the 18th and 19th century. The other thing I've been doing is something I've never ever done before. I've been involved in a lot of online outreach projects. So I'm involved with a group of musicians, and we've been telling stories about women who are engineers, women who were scientists, and they've been writing music about it, and I've been making PowerPoints, and we've been showing pictures, and it's very locally based. So the one we're doing at the moment is about the county of Essex, which is in the east of England, and we've got 6 women scientists who were based in Essex from the 17th century up to the present. And I'm talking about their history, and then we've got a modern scientist from Essex, and we're talking about what she's doing in Essex. So it's a very local project about science, and we've been doing that in different places in the country, and it's a very exciting way to talk about science history because it's musical in its performance, it's not just books.
Thank you.
We have a question from our Facebook listeners who's asking, this Muhammad Asif Khan, asking about the difference between developing a scientific mindset and teaching and practice of science.
I don't really understand the question.
Okay, so to give you an example, in India, for example, we have scientists and even Minister of Science talking about things like you need to drink cow urine to cure coronavirus and things like that. So people who have studied science in school or university, they have this they have a lack of development of a scientific mindset in the sense that following reason and facts. So I think the listener was asking about that, the difference between having developed a scientific mindset and just kind of rote learning of science.
So developing a scientific mindset would be the inclination to approach every problem logically and quantitatively and rationally, which is not necessarily, in my opinion, the best way of solving every problem. I mean, I think art and literature and religion are also important, but it is, I mean, this isn't a debate I've really heard before, but I suppose it is different from, you can get through your exams by learning the answers to the questions and just writing them down on a piece of paper, which is different from approaching everything logically and with an open mind and rationally. Is that the sort of thing that you're asking? I don't really quite understand.
I can probably give you an example.
Yeah.
For example, somebody is teaching something in a science class, but he does not actually believe it, and he puts that in such a way that the students actually thinks that the scientific fact that he is teaching is actually not the fact. So the problem here is that the teacher himself does not believe in science in general or on that scientific invention, but he is teaching science. So how, I'm guessing the person who is asking is how to solve these kind of problems in a society, that because
Well, it's not a problem I've ever encountered
Yeah, the problem
I mean,
is
if I was a teacher,
when
I wouldn't want to teach something that I didn't believe in, because your fundamental responsibility to your students is to help your students and improve.
the problem is here getting a job. For example, so if you don't get a job, your livelihood would not go as well as you expect, right? So people would take jobs for wherever they can, even if they are not 100% uh, uh, into that profession. And that this happens to many of the job sectors in our country, because you cannot just choose between jobs that you like to do. So
So I suppose the equivalent would be when Marie Curie was a little girl and she was growing up in Poland. Poland was occupied by the Russians, and she wasn't allowed to speak Polish at school. She spoke Polish at home, but at school she had to do absolutely everything in Russian. And I can imagine there were a lot of teachers, the history teachers, were telling the school children about how wonderful Russia was. And all the children were writing that down, but nobody really believed it at all. Would that be the sort of equivalent?
yeah, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's a very, very interesting question. And well, you could tell from my reaction, it's not a problem that I've come across. I didn't know that problem existed. And I suppose it would be, well, I have had students in my class occasionally who are fundamentalist Christians, and when we get on to the Darwin part of the syllabus, they feel very uncomfortable talking about that. Or I suppose another equivalent would be if I, for some reason, had to teach Christianity, had to teach religious education. I could mouth it but not believe in it. But I had no idea that was happening with science, and it's extremely interesting and very sad. Very sad that people are being put in that position of having to teach students a thing that they don't themselves believe in. That's horrible. Sorry, I'm completely taken aback by the situation. I had no idea.
This is the majority of cases, but this is some portion of the cases are like this.
And so then what they're doing is disseminating an anti-science. These teachers are disseminating an anti-science attitude because they don't believe in the science themselves.
They will probably teach some part of the science from the science book, but what they don't like, they will not teach it, or teach it in such a way that the students will not believe it. So,
I don't know. I have no idea if that's a problem that exists in any part of Britain. I have never heard it, but it might be that in some schools that is happening. I have no idea. And it's extremely interesting, and I will try and find out more about it. I just have no idea that was an issue.
I have one more question, and that is, you mentioned in your book about, for example, I can give you an example like Copernicus. So he is actually seen as a revolutionary hero in science, and a part of it, and a lot of young scientists actually look up to him and thinks him as a hero. But in your book, you actually argued that he was actually more like a theorist, and he was looking at the previous literature rather than doing the experiments by himself. And there is some political part of making him the hero.
Okay, so there's several interesting things. One is that in recent years, historians of science who specialize in Islamic culture have shown that there were Islamic sages who were putting the sun at the center of the universe before Copernicus did. And Copernicus, it seems, it was very likely that Copernicus knew about that work. So I think that's one very interesting aspect of the way that Copernicus has been made a hero. Another interesting aspect is he was indeed a religious person. He was what's called a canon of the church. And there were two, when we think of science now, science, physics, chemistry, and maths are absolutely inseparable. But then there were two different ways of looking at the world. There was the philosophical way, which is to ask how does the world work, to explain why things happen. And then the other way of looking at the world was the mathematical way, and that was to describe what happens, to build equations, to build models. And that same division was true in the Islamic culture as was true in European culture. And so the people who were surrounding Copernicus were quite happy to accept that mathematically it makes much, much more sense if you put the sun at the center of the universe, because then it gets away with all sorts of problems about what are called epicycles, about planets looking as though they're going backwards. It makes much more sense to believe that the sun is to describe the universe mathematically as if the sun were at the center. What Copernicus himself believed that the sun really was at the center of the universe. But a lot of other people said, well, we can accept the mathematical description, but we still are going to believe that the Earth is at the center of the universe. And I mean, for a European person, I think another interesting aspect about Copernicus is that during the Second World War, Copernicus was Polish, and Poland was occupied by Germany, and Copernicus appeared on German Nazi stamps as a German hero. And that enormously antagonized a lot of Polish people who were very, very keen to reclaim him as a Polish hero rather than as a German one. So those are three different aspects of the way that Copernicus has been made into a great hero. And I think they illustrate quite well how there's always new stories to tell about the history of science, and that's what makes history so fascinating. You can find new facts, but you can also tell new stories from the facts, and that's what attracts me to it.
Do you think these kind of narratives will downgrade the enthusiasm of the young mind who think that Copernicus is a great hero, but if you tell them that, okay, these are the facts and these things happen, would they feel a little down?
Personally, I think on the contrary, I think if you make heroes too much on a pedestal, then there's someone you can't emulate. So Marie Curie, for example, when she went to America, she was raising money to buy some radium for the Cancer Institute in Paris. And American women were incredibly supportive and enthusiastic, but by that stage they regarded her as so special and so enormously clever that they could never aspire to emulate her. So I think having these enormous sort of super intellectual heroes like Einstein or Newton is actually a bit of a discouragement, because if you're sitting at school or at university and you're thinking, well, it's just me and I'm just an ordinary person, I can't possibly do something like that, a hero's no use at all. And I think it's part of the reason I want to sort of bring more women into the history of science. There's loads and loads and loads of people. It's a collective endeavor, and everybody can contribute and everybody can do something, and you don't have to be scared that you haven't got the brains of a Newton or an Einstein, because they were probably in some ways quite ordinary people too. They've just, all these stories have been told about them. They're artificial, fabricated heroes.
Yeah, good point. So I'm guessing we are at the very end of our discussion today. So do you want to tell something from your experience to the young historians and science writers?
If you want to do something, just go out there and do it. I got a degree in physics. I stopped doing that and I became a historian of science because that was what I really, really wanted to do. And when you're planning your career, don't think sort of like 10 years ahead, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a space scientist, therefore I should now study things which I'm not interested in. That is not right. What you should always do is study the thing that really inspires you, the thing that really interests you. And it doesn't matter if it's something very unusual, or your parents want you to do something different, or your friends think that's a bit weird. That doesn't matter. It's really hard studying. And if you're not interested in what you're studying, then it becomes impossible. So go for what you're really, really interested in, what inspires you, what makes you passionate, and never mind if everybody else thinks that's a bit odd. You just go for what you want.
That's very encouraging, and I hope our young writers will get interested in writing about science and history of science. Thank you very much for being with us today, Dr. Patricia Fara.
And thank the audience for all those very, very interesting questions. And I'm really, really happy that so many young students are listening as well. I think that's a great compliment, and I feel very flattered and honoured that you took the time to listen to me. So thank you.
Yeah, and we would probably ask you to appear again in future with.
I'd love to.
Great, that would be great for us. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.